Okay, so here we are with another episode of Brian for Liberty. I had resisted the urge to do a podcast regarding the coronavirus. I didn't want to do a video on this. This is not a topic that I really wanted to hit on or to make a focus of any of my episodes, but at the end of the day, this is the news that's coming in, this is the information that's coming out. And so it's almost impossible to not address it. So I'm going to go over some things here, and I'm not going to offer opinions regarding the dangers of the virus itself. I'm not going to talk about what we should or should not be doing to the extent of I'm not going to talk about government reaction and whether I feel like it's right or wrong. What I am going to talk about is just the spread of this virus in general and my opinion of kind of what's going on out there and what I'm seeing on social media. Because if we're all really honest with each other, we're not looking at mainstream media as the primary source of our information anymore. Quite frankly, we're going online, we're going to social media, and we're looking for input from people in those spheres and taking their advice. So there are a lot of, I think, troubling trends that are starting to arise on social media when it comes to this virus. And as I'm watching what's happening in Italy and I'm watching what's happening in Spain, and I'm even looking at now what's happening in New York City and Michigan and California and the places that are being hit really hard by this virus, I'm very concerned that there are so many unqualified opinions out there that are really based more in political belief than they are in anything medically related. Okay, so you have a lot of unqualified opinions, you have a lot of angry people. Now, I'm a libertarian and I'm angry. I think the government has massively overstepped its bounds. I think its authority to tell us what to do. I think that there's definitely things that are happening out there from a governmental perspective in terms of enforcing stay-at-home orders, forcing businesses to close, and things of that nature that really do bother me and really do speak to me as a libertarian, and they really make me want to revolt against these orders and the guidance that's being put out. The problem is this: we don't have a great method of testing the legality of some of these things. And when we're talking about resisting these orders, I think what's coming out is kind of a half-cocked opinion of government's telling us to do this, so we should do the opposite. I'm a libertarian, I hate government, so I'm going to do the opposite of whatever they tell me to. Whether they're right or wrong from a legal perspective is largely irrelevant when it comes to are we are we doing what's best for humanity? Are we doing what's best for our fellow man? There's no question in my mind when, like I said, when I see what's happening in New York and I see what's happening in Italy and I see hospitals being overrun, the massive spread as the testing becomes more available, you're seeing more and more people test positive. You're definitely seeing issues particularly in New York, with hospitals not being able to keep up with the volume, and you have healthcare professionals, people on the ground in the areas telling you, please, please follow these orders. Please, please stay inside, isolate yourself, practice social isolation, because this thing is getting out of hand. And we're getting to a point where we're going to see things in the United States that we've never seen before, where we're turning people away and we're not giving care to people who need it because we don't have the capacity to handle it. So we're trying to balance the need to social distance, the need to control this spread, the need to flatten the curve, and we're trying to balance that against the need to make sure that we maintain our civil liberties, that we maintain the ability to operate our businesses and get out and live our lives. So the natural knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, I'm going to resist this, I'm going to fight this because this is government, is not the right argument to be making. The right argument to be making is we need to be challenging this stuff legally. We need to go out. Hey, if you're opposed to these stay-at-home orders, you're opposed to these orders about being able to gather in groups larger than 10. I've seen as little as 3 in some places. Then go get fined and take this to court and fight your fight. And we need to have a better definition of what government is and is not able to do. However, we also need to recognize that there is a responsibility to our fellow man out there. Okay, we have to look at this and recognize that we are not experts because of our political opinions. Okay, I'm not an expert on what's happening, how fast this virus can spread, what the fatality. We don't know a lot about this particular virus. So the idea that I'm going to rebel just for the sake of rebellion. And I'm going to go off half-cocked, and I'm going to run out and put other people at risk because government's telling me to do something, and my natural instinct is to resist that, is foolhardy. We are putting people at risk, and we need to stop with the rhetoric of the rhetoric is tied into two different things. There's the natural reaction to I don't want government telling me what to do. That's the natural liberty-minded reaction is government's telling me to do this, therefore I have to think it's wrong, and therefore I have to resist it. Okay, that's part one. Part two is, and that's okay. I can accept that. I can say I understand where you're coming from. I feel it too. It feels very wrong to have government restricting my life in the way that it is. And so I'm going to naturally want to resist this. I'm going to want to fight it. That I can understand. What I don't understand, and what is really troubling to me, is the fact that so many people of that political ilk are also saying that this is an overblown thing, that this isn't as serious as they're making it out to be. I am constantly seeing unqualified opinions on the seriousness of the illness itself. Your political ideology does not make you an expert on this particular thing, okay? So when you are downplaying the seriousness of the illness, and I'm not an expert, okay? And so if I say it's super serious, I am not qualified to make that statement. I'm not qualified to refute that statement. I don't know. What I do know is that it has a higher fatality rate than the flu. I can see that. It's obvious in terms of what's happening. It has a very high transmission rate. I know that elderly people are at high risk. I know that people with underlying conditions are at high risk. So my natural responsibility to my fellow man is to say, I am going to follow these instructions. I'm going to listen to the advice of people who are experts in this field. And I am going to isolate myself. I do not like and I do not agree with the steps that government is taking. I think they're going too far. I think they are overreaching. I think they are abusing power. But at the same time, I can feel that way and still behave responsibly and still take steps that I am not unnecessarily putting my fellow man at risk. Do we need the orders? Do we need the stay at homes? Do we need those things? I don't know. I think that when you look at what was going on in spring break in Florida and you have all these people flocking to the beach in complete disregard of the seriousness of the situation, that you can obviously make a case. There's a case to be made to say, well, yeah, government has to intervene here because people aren't listening. So it's foolhardy to say they're all wrong and we're right because we don't have the expertise, the majority of us, the laymen out there who aren't trained in these fields, to say, I'm going to resist this and we need to, government's overreacting and government shouldn't be playing any kind of a role in restricting the gathering of people. And then, of course, right away you go back to, well, do you trade liberty for safety and security? You end up with neither one. Well, we'll also either end up with neither one if a massive medical crisis destroys our economy and large numbers of people are dying. Well, you don't have liberty. You can't practice liberty when you're dead either. Okay? These are temporary measures that are being put in place to protect your fellow man. Again, I can't say it enough. I do believe government's overreaching. I think that they are exercising powers that are unconstitutional, and we should resist that. And as this crisis continues to grow and more as it abates, we need to look back on this situation and say, what are the things that need to be put in place so that we can properly deal with this kind of a crisis without violating rights, but at the same time protecting people. But again, I can't say it enough that stop with the unqualified opinions regarding the sickness itself, the illness itself. I don't want to hear that, I looked at Google and I read these two articles and, take a bunch of vitamin C and you'll be fine. That's ridiculous. You're not qualified to make that statement. I don't care how many hours you spend on Google researching this problem. So what I'd like to see is, here's what government's doing. Here's why it's wrong, and here's how we fix this so that we don't end up in another situation, in another crisis where we can clearly see the government's overstepping its bounds. So there's a lot going on out there. I think there's a lot of fear. I think there's a lot of anger. And it's both things. It's fear and it's anger towards what's happening. It's fear, it's anger to how government is responding to it. But at the end of the day, let's try and stay in our lanes and really focus on the things that we should be discussing. To that end, I will definitely touch on the response in terms of, from an economic perspective, of this massive coronavirus spending bill. This is $2 trillion of taxpayer money. This represents about a $24,000 of additional debt for every family of four out there. It's about $6,000 per person when you add it all up. Excuse me. When you add it all up, you're looking at $6,000 for every citizen. And we have to look at this. This is the thing we're supposed to be talking about realistically. As libertarians, this is what we should be discussing, right? We're going to take some short-term measures, and the government's going to do things to protect us. Whether you think it's protection or, I don't want to get into, again, the philosophical conversation here, but government's going to take steps that they think are necessary. Whether you agree with that or not is irrelevant. These are short-term measures, right? The government's not locking you down forever. They're not going to close these businesses forever. This is temporary stuff. What we want to look at is long-term structural changes to the way that our government functions. And we want to look at long-term functional changes to our economy and what is the impact of this going to be as this crisis abates and we're dealing with the aftermath, okay? Keep in mind, at the beginning of this year, we were already going to be facing a federal budget deficit of $1 trillion. We were already going to be increasing the amount of national debt by $1 trillion. That was before the $2 trillion spending bill, and it's also before the massive decrease in tax revenue that the government's going to see as a result of all these businesses being closed, the mass layoffs, the unemployment that is sure to follow, and the long-term financial and economic impacts moving forward. So you take the fact that we're already $1 trillion in the hole. Now you take the fact that we're going to see a massive decrease in tax payrolls, tax revenue. So that $1 trillion is already going to massively increase. Throw on top of that another $2 trillion in spending. And you got to start recognizing the fact that, look, we're $23 trillion in debt already. There's no real argument for the fact that we're probably going to be $25 to $26 trillion in debt as a nation by the end of this year. We're paying $500 billion in interest payments alone on our debt. We're massively adding spending. And so we have to look at this bill and we have to say, what is the government doing? Does this make sense in the response to the crisis at hand? So we're going to kind of walk through some of these things and say what's good, what's bad, and I'm going to disagree a little bit I'm looking at the Federalist right now, and their arguments of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the latest spending bill. And I'm going to go through this point by point quickly just to kind of touch on some of the bigger ticket items here. And so the first thing is listed under the good, and that's the payroll tax deferral. So for those of you who don't understand, payroll taxes are taxes on that's your Medicare, Medicaid, your FICA taxes that come out of your check. On the other side of those taxes is the amount that your employer is paying, right? So your employer, for every dollar they pay you, they're also paying a percentage to the government to pay for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So what they're going to do is they will defer the payments of payroll tax to be paid. They're suspended through the end of this year, and it's going to be paid half by year, 2021, 2022. So what they're essentially saying is we're going to do catch-up payments into this program. So the Federalist and kind of a libertarian view is, hey, any suspension of taxation is a good thing. This is going to increase liquidity. Businesses are going to have more money. They're going to have to pay this money back. The payroll tax is going to have to be paid back. But is there accounting in here? I guess my question would be, even though they view this as a good thing, I look at it and I say, okay, well, we're going to not pay payroll taxes for the next, 9 months, 8 months. What is this? This is April. So, for the rest of this year, we're not going to pay payroll taxes. Okay. Well, let's say we're left with structural large unemployment at the end of this year. The fact that they're going to be paying that back, how does this get paid back exactly, right? If we are going to have larger unemployment, we're going to have less payroll taxes coming in on the backside of this. So if we are deferring payroll taxes now and we have less people on payroll down the road because of structural unemployment, are they just going to have to pay more payroll taxes for everybody that is working? or are we going to end up with a shortfall? Because a shortfall in the payroll tax and in those collections creates a shortfall in the Social Security system, which we already know exists. We already know that Social Security is not going to live up to all of its obligations. Um, I think it's by 2035, 2045, something like that. They're not going to be able to live up to 100% of their obligations. So are we creating the potential for a structural issue in the Social Security and in the Social Security program that we're going to have to deal with down the road through other forms of taxation? If we're not reducing spending and we're reducing revenue, we're just pushing something down the road. Okay, so that's an issue I have with the payroll tax deferral. And that's one of the main components of this bill. Next thing is that there's going to be money for the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve's I'll read the paragraph here. The Federal Reserve's new lending facility is funded with $425 billion, which will be levered to provide up to $4 trillion in liquidity to distressed businesses. Now, this is an interesting thing here. So we have $425 billion that's going to be leveraged into $4 trillion in liquidity. The interesting thing is that the Federal Reserve has already come forward and said that they're going to be providing massive amounts of liquidity into the banking system. So I don't understand why the taxpayer needs to be on the hook to lend to business when the Federal Reserve is already sending a ton of money into the banking system. Shouldn't we be using the liquidity that the Federal Reserve is sending into the banking system to provide lending to distressed businesses? Shouldn't that be the purpose of that money? We all know what the purpose of that money is, and it's to prop up the equity markets. And I'm not saying that doesn't benefit the average person. It does prop up your 401k plan. It does, keep stock prices up. But the idea that the taxpayer should be on the hook to lend billions of dollars to business is a little bothersome to me. I like that there's going to be liquidity. We know that the businesses need help. We know that we're going to have issues here with employment, with businesses that are just shut down through the duration of this crisis. So there's liquidity is needed, but it feels like the Federal Reserve is already taking those steps, and I don't understand why another $425 billion has to be burdened upon the taxpayers in terms of lending. What if these businesses go out of business? What if there are bankruptcies? What happens to that money then? So we saw this in the TARP bill during the housing crisis, and all reports are that worked out well for us, but we don't know. This is uncharted territory. This is going to be a greater economic crisis than the housing crisis was, and we don't know what these businesses are going to look like on the other side. And so for the taxpayer to be on the hook for that lending, that bothers me. And furthermore, what are the cash position of some of these large businesses? I mean, we're bailing out the airlines. What's the cash position of a Delta, or what's the cash position of some of these incredibly profitable businesses that have taken steps to avoid paying taxes, and now they're getting a taxpayer-funded bailout? I have a little bit of an issue with that. So there's some other things here that are a little bit more, minute. There's exemption for distillers to produce hand sanitizer. I like that a lot. Let's convert some of this production to help society and not and exempt that production from taxation. I think that's a great idea. The 4 months of full pay unemployment above earnings, I think that is a major issue. This is something I actually watched being debated on the House floor last night, and the argument being made against it is a valid argument. I should not be unemployed and making as much money as I made while working. It is an removal of the incentive to work. It will reduce labor force participation. It creates a situation where workers are not going to, we need productivity returning to the workforce, not people staying on benefits and not working. Productivity is going to have to come back. People are going to have to go back to work. Businesses are going to have to reopen. You're going to have companies that aren't going to be able to restaff. If you are providing all of this money to not work, you are incentivizing people to not work. I think it's a terrible idea. I think you're going to see you heard about it a lot during the Obama administration after the bill for the economic crisis regarding housing. The housing crisis happened. Is that, unemployment numbers were falling because people were literally falling off of, they weren't being counted anymore because they'd been so de-incentivized for working, that they just stopped looking for work. And you saw unemployment numbers were going down, but the labor force participation rate was also staying low. People were choosing to stay home and not work. And that's a very dangerous thing. And we want to make sure that we are not destroying the incentive to go out and work. This is an important part of our economy, and it's an important part of the human psyche to go out, seek employment, and work to improve your situation. And if you take that incentive away, you're not just hurting the economy, you're actually hurting people. So I really have an issue with the massive increase in the unemployment dollars. I think the worst thing, one of the worst things, is these a massive amount of spending in this bill in a time when we are running $1 trillion deficit, spending another $2 trillion on top of that, and facing falling revenue from an economic crisis. That we are going to put $75 million of taxpayer money into the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, $75 million for the National Endowment for the Arts, $50 million for museum and library services, $25 million for the Kennedy Center, Internal Revenue Service, $250 million, House of Representatives salaries and expenses, $25 million. This is taxpayer money. This is taxpayer money they don't have. This is borrowing against our future. Why? Why in a crisis bill? Why in a bill that's designed to help the American economy and help the American worker are we putting all this pork, all this spending that has nothing to do with responding to the coronavirus into a bill like this? It's ridiculous. We should be holding our elected representatives accountable for this. This is unexcusable behavior by our government, and just an absolutely clear example of how irresponsible they are with your money. Mandatory neutrality in union organizing drives. Essentially, medium-sized businesses from 500 to 10,000 employees cannot oppose any union organizing campaign for the duration of a federal loan. This is ridiculous. This is a string being attached to money that's supposed to help these businesses stay open. It's a handout for unions. Look, we can argue the merits of unionization, and we can argue the merits of a company being allowed to oppose their employees trying to unionize. I can have that argument with you. I can sit down and have a philosophical argument about why business should not stop their employees from unionizing. I think the freedom to unionize is, I don't agree with unions. I'm not in a union. I don't think they're necessary in the modern economy, but I'm willing to sit down and have that argument. To push something like this into a bill for coronavirus relief is, again, it's disgusting. It's a terrible move. It has nothing to do with relieving coronavirus. It has nothing to do with the purpose of this bill. When you look at the fact that this thing was delayed, these kinds of things are the reason why. Bigger student loan subsidies. This is terrible. We already know. I don't even have to go over the fact that government subsidizing borrowing for students is a terrible idea. We're talking to 18-year-old kids and getting them to get into debt that they're not going to pay off for 20 years. We are pushing up the cost of tuitions by making way more money than the market would otherwise provide available to these universities. This is a bad idea. It has nothing to do, once again, with coronavirus relief. It's just another piece of legislation that got stuffed into a bill because you were going to look bad opposing it. So that's just another terrible thing that was shoved into this bill that had no business being there. So the bottom line is massive components of the economy are shut down. There's going to be fear even as this thing abates, even as we go back to work, even as these businesses start reopening. There's going to be fear. There's going to be large levels of unemployment. There's going to be less money to be spent. Then there's going to be a much more conservative attitude from a lot of people in terms of just going out and engaging in commerce and preferring to stay home out of just fear from this event. So I think that we may be stepping into this a little early with a $2 trillion expenditure, and we don't know what this is going to look like in a month or 2 months. Are we going to need more? Are we going to need less? Are these even the right moves that we're making? We are still at the very beginning of this thing, and I don't feel like the right amount of thought and consideration was given to this bill. This is a classic government politician kind of wanting to look like they're doing something, and so rushing to get a bill passed. The idea that we could spend $2 trillion in such a short period of time may be encouraging to some, but to me, it's terrifying. We are mortgaging our futures. We are going to have to pay this debt back. We are reaching a fiscal tipping point in this country in terms of the amount of debt we can carry and the amount of debt we can afford to keep paying on. So when I look at this bill overall, I understand the fear that drives people to support it, but it is way too flawed. It is way too big to have been passed in such a hasty manner. So I wanted to get on and do a podcast. The Taxation and Theft podcast is still going to happen on Saturday. So I hope you will join me. I am Brian for the number 4 Liberty. You can find me on Spotify. I am Brian for Liberty on Facebook. I am Brian for Liberty on Instagram. And I am Brian for Liberty on TikTok. That's right. I am a 44-year-old man posting on TikTok, and I am enjoying it. So I hope you'll seek me out, find me, criticize me, tell me don't know what I'm talking about. That's all perfectly fine. I'm out here, and I'm willing to listen to what you have to say. So I will get this thing up, and I hope to hear from you.